Welcome to Insights from a third-party ISO 22301 auditor. You will have an opportunity today to ask the auditors your questions about the transition from the 2012 version of ISO 22301 to the 2019 version. We will be using the questions that have been submitted first, but you will also have the opportunity to submit some questions as we go along. So introducing you today, I'd like to introduce Tim Whitcomb. He's the director at NQA, as well as Jim Nelson, who's an auditor for NQA. Tim is a certified BCMS lead auditor who's worked in the ISO, trying to get my screen to move away, in the ISO-based management systems field for over 20 years, honing his expertise in standards such as ISO 22301, 27001, and 9001, and the related disciplines throughout that period. As a certified management systems lead auditor, he has led and participated in hundreds of third-party audits for organizations in the ICT, finance, manufacturing, and service industries around the world. This hands-on experience, combined with an MBA from the University of Massachusetts Eisenberg School of Management, have laid the foundation for Tim's present senior executive role as Business Unit Director for NQA, a leading global certification body, where he directly oversees all aspects of NQA's BCMS and ISMS programs, amongst others. Tim is also an industry contributor for various standards writing and oversight bodies in the BCMS and ICT spaces. He serves as the BCP SME for NQA and BCP owner, like got enough acronyms there, for the business unit functions within NQA. Jim has more than 3 decades of experience in BCMS and related sectors. He's an ISO 22301 lead auditor and holds several other of the prestigious certifications in business continuity. Jim is a U.S. delegate to ISO and has been actively engaged and involved in the development of ISO 22301 and the series of standards, including the guidance and technical specifications. He also serves as an expert on several other ISO technical committees. NQA engages Jim for ISO 22301 certification audits. This includes ISO audit work domestically and internationally. He is also the president of Business Continuity Services. BCS provides strategic and operational expertise in managing risk and increasing the resilience of organizations globally. In addition, Jim serves as the chair and a founding member of ICOR. Welcome both Tim and Jim. Our webinar objective today is to gain an understanding of how to implement the changes to ISO 22301 and how to demonstrate conformance. A couple of logistics pieces. The recording of the webinar will be available on our ICOR webinar page. It's usually up by the next day, but we say 2 days just to be safe. We want you to ask questions, so use the questions button. We will try to answer your questions during the webinar, and if we don't have time or the question isn't exactly pertaining to what we're talking about here, we will answer you in an email after the webinar. Anyone who attends at least 35 minutes will also receive a certificate of attendance where you'll get 1 hour of credit. So I'd like to start with just a short poll so that we can get to know you a little bit, and the auditors have an idea of who's attending. So if you could, we'll only have the poll open for about 10 seconds. And we're about 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Finish, if you can go ahead and finish your poll. And I'm going to share the results. It looks like we have about 63% familiar with ISO 22301, about 16% not familiar. On that same alignment, we have 38% where the organization is aligned to the standard, with about 19% certified to the standard. And then in between there, we have 6% not aligned. So I'm going to go ahead and now share. Tim Whitcomb is going to lead us off, and he will become our first speaker of the day.
Okay. Thank you for that. So I get the privilege of starting us off here and going through about the first half of the standard, and then Jim will pick up from there. But before we get into that, I know there were some questions just about the overall audit process. So Linda was nice enough to kind of queue up some of those questions that came in early, so we'll go through that. So I think it's worth talking about the ISO audit process itself, just at a real high level. ISO certifications, by definition, require a third party to audit. So NQA is an example of that. We're a third party certification body or registrar or audit firm, different names or acronyms that you might be given for organizations like us. But we would come into an organization, look at what they've done to set up, in this case, a BCMS in alignment to ISO 22301. And the standards, as probably most of the audience knows, since you're somewhat familiar with it, fairly generic. So the role of the auditor and the audit process is to look at how a given organization has chosen to meet those requirements and really confirm that they've met the requirements. So it is, by and large, a review of the various policies, plans, procedures that the organization itself has created. Again, tying it back or anchoring it back to the standard, but for most part, we're using your own documentation. And then looking at, again, your own tools or activities or exercises to serve as what we would call objective evidence to support that you've indeed implemented and are following the policies and procedures you've written. One of the unique things about BCMS or 22301 audits is that it typically does not involve looking at the BCMS activities in action. Compare that to something like an ISO 9000 audit, which is more of a quality or production type audit, and that very much hinges on having the auditors go out to the production floor and watch the manufacturing of whatever widget might be in place. BCMS, typically the auditors not get to see any of the continuity plans in place, or not even any of the exercises or testing being done necessarily. Of course, we're in a unique situation now where that's not necessarily the case, but normally, it's kind of reviewing a lot of hypotheticals, a lot of documentation. That said, the audits are still typically on site, but again, with the big asterisk that currently there are allowances for audits to be conducted remotely, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second here. So suffice to say that any 22301 audits occurring now, and there are audits occurring now, are being done remotely. The process kind of culminates with the audit report that the auditor would issue, which, as one of the key parts of it, would have any what are called non-conformances in the ISO world. So non-conformances against either, again, the organization's policies or procedures that they've written, or it could be in some cases tied back to the requirements of the ISO standard. Those non-conformances then are left with the organization to come up with a corrective action plan for, to close those gaps or fix those issues. That corrective action is concurred with and reviewed by the auditor, and then that kind of sets you off into an ongoing sequence. So ISO is not a one and done type of thing. After that initial certification lift, there is an ongoing cadence of surveillances, which are kind of partial audits in the first 2 years after your initial certification. And then on the third year, a more robust recertification process by which that whole cycle starts over again. So it is kind of an ongoing activity. With that, again, there were a couple early questions that came in about virtual audits, again, based on the current scenarios. And the short of that is there are governing bodies around ISO, IAF being one of the international ones, and ANAB being one of the domestic ones here in the US. So they've recognized the fact that we don't want folks running around to organizations on site as we used to. A lot of the organizations aren't operating the same way they were. So there always were standing allowances for what they call ICT audits, or audits conducted by information and communications technology. i.e. remote audits or virtual audits. So those were standing rules that were used at some levels. In fact, the rules kind of, depending which industry we're in, would limit how much of an audit could be conducted remotely. But those rules have been loosened a bit now to the point where it's really up to the certification body and the organization to determine if the audit can be conducted effectively remotely and if it can be conducted fully effectively remotely, which in the case of business continuity, the answer is usually yes, because again, we're usually looking at documents or records. There's not much of a physical aspect to these audits other than a little bit of layout of the building and some of the life safety stuff, but even some of that can be viewed virtually. So for the short of it is remote audits are a thing now. As to how long they'll be allowed to continue, that's really somewhat of a question. Again, the BCMS industry itself does not have any strict limitation. I can speak for myself. I know we've done some audits remotely in the past prior to the current situation. So I think that'll be a case-by-case basis, but remote audits will continue to be a thing as we go along. In terms of case studies and special techniques, it's a lot of probably what you're experiencing in your day-to-day work environment today, again, where you're getting on not so much a webinar, but a desktop sharing type web meeting. So using things like GoToMeeting or WebEx or Zoom perhaps, Teams, Skype, any number of platforms that are out there. And basically having the auditor as one of the attendees to the meeting, having your business continuity team as the other attendees, and sharing the various documents or records that support your business continuity and your business continuity plans and activities. So that's kind of the examples there. There was also a question about how ISO audits compare to IIA audits, and I'm not going to profess to be an IIA expert, but in terms of the main criteria that the individual is asking about, those being criteria, condition, cause, and effect, I think the way that ISO would kind of interpret those same things, because at the end of the day, we're talking about audits, and yes, there are different terms and maybe some slight nuances, but I think at some common denominator level, an audit is an audit. So ISO would talk about the criteria in terms of number one, the requirements of the given standard. So those are some very base criteria. Again, they're going to be very generic. So they're the component of the criteria, or that correct state, more specifically, would be what the organization itself then documents as far as the business continuity procedures or policies. Now the condition, of course, is what the auditor finds when they come on site or currently do the remote audit. So that's a lot of the information gathered, the objective evidence, as we call it, gathered during the course of the audit. So very much similar there. In the ISO world, there is a report that comes out, again, with those non-conformances. And I think I'm going to jump to step 4 there, or part 4, the effect. That's really where the ISO world talks about those non-conformances breaking down into different levels, which would align to the exposure or impact of those non-conformances. ISO, most CBs talk about either major non-conformances or minor non-conformances. And then there's also often things that are brought up as observations, and also things that can be brought up as opportunities for improvement. So that kind of runs the continuum of the effect with regards to how ISO terms it. And then last, jumping back up to number 3, the reason for those non-conformances in the ISO world, that's really left to the organization to sort out. So that's probably the one major difference, where IAA is focused more on internal audits. As an external audit body, we're not allowed to consult. So we'll let the organization take the lead on determining what we would call the root cause of those non-conformances are. The auditor then gets involved to review what was determined by the organization as both the root cause and a proposed corrective action for that. Once the auditor has agreed that they found the right cause and proposed a suitable action, the organization implements that corrective action, and then again it loops back to the auditor to review that implementation and determine whether or not that was effective. So probably that's the biggest difference, but at the end of the day, I think there's more similarities than differences there. All right, so with that, one other item to speak about before we get into the changes themselves is this is all going to precipitate a transition for anyone that is currently certified. And folks that have other ISO certifications are probably familiar with this. It's following a very similar pattern. The standards themselves are updated every few years, or at least reviewed every few years, and most often updated. So obviously with 22301, it was a 7-year cycle between the previous version. The standard came out in October of 2019, and typically there's a 3-year transition period. But again, due to the current constraints and conditions, the IAF has added an additional 6 months to really all transitions at this point. So the current transition period for 22301 now is extended until April 30th of 2023. Seems like a long time away. But basically what that means is for anyone that holds an existing certification to the 2012 version of the standard has technically until that date to convert their system to the 2019 version. Now, I think one of the things that we'll hopefully go through in this presentation is that the changes are not necessarily super major. There are some significant changes in some cases, and there certainly are some things that will require organizations to look at and potentially add or make amendments to their system. But I think the guidance generally would be that they're not going to be that large of a lift. Therefore, waiting until 2023 is probably not well advised. What we typically advise our organizations is to get to it sooner than later. But there is that additional period allowed. And basically you don't want to get to that end date and not have a plan to transition, because if you do, the 2012 version more or less becomes obsolete at that point. Your certification in turn becomes obsolete, and to get recertified, you kind of need to go back to square one. So it's not that it's unachievable, it's just not very effective to go that way. All right, so getting into the changes themselves to the 2019 version of the standard, at a glance, at a 50,000 foot level, a lot of what we're going to be talking about is editorial changes. Some of it is removing what were a lot of duplications. So compartmentalizing certain thoughts into one area as opposed to having them threaded throughout multiple requirements. Some formatting changes. Again, for those folks familiar with the standard will know that the 2012 version in some cases had kind of rambling run-on requirements that were not well annotated in terms of if someone wanted to point to a particular requirement or clause. Bullets weren't numbered or lettered in some cases, and again, there were kind of sentences or paragraphs after paragraph. So you'll see a little more structure in that respect. What I would consider kind of a minor change, and some of these changes were driven by the underlying ISO template, if you will. One of the changes there being the difference between establish, implement, and maintain versus just simply implement and maintain. I don't think that would have changed much behavior. And then finally, again, clauses 4 through 7 and 9 through 10, for those that are familiar, will be more of the ISO basics or the management system components of the standard, whereas clause 8, really in any ISO standard, is where the flavor of that particular standard comes out. So with 22301, obviously the flavor is business continuity. So again, kind of going back up to item 1, a strong effort to try to consolidate all of the business continuity requirements strictly within section 8, and we'll see some examples of that. So overall, no significant redirection, if you will, but some cleanup, some organization, hopefully making it easier to understand the intents and implement. The structure, as you see here, remains relatively unchanged. There were some minor changes in what's being called the front matter. Those are more informational sections. Technically, those sections are not auditable. The auditable requirements begin with section 4 and run through section 10. That structure, again, remains unchanged, but some of the content within it, obviously, is what we're going to talk about. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about the simple grammatical or some of the simple editorial changes, so we'll focus mainly on the material ones. But again, be aware that in part because of the ISO template or the Annex L or SL, as they're back to calling it now, that structure had some updates, so part and parcel, the 22301 had to adopt those changes as well. One of the things that you will see or will not see, as the case were, is the term risk appetite. And I think probably everyone on the call is familiar with the term risk appetite and probably uses it in their lexicon. But you will not see that term exactly in the standard. What you will see, however, is more or less the definition of that. So that was a conscious choice by the writers to really go back to the definition. So in this case, being defined as the amount and type of risk that an organization may or may not take. I think part of the thinking on that, again, is these ISO standards are used globally and translated globally. So sometimes it's better to spell out what's meant so that it can be translated word for word, as opposed to using a term that might translate a little bit differently. So I know that's some of the thinking behind that. But suffice to say, I'm sure organizations will still talk about risk appetite, and that's fine. I'm guessing some auditors will still talk about risk appetite, and that's okay as well. But just recognize that the term itself technically has gone away, but certainly the intent has not. So it's not as if that's disappeared. Okay, so context of the organization is your section 4. So we're getting into the first bits of the auditable requirements in the standard. Section 4 kind of starts off the thinking as an organization implements a management system. And context of the organization, very simply, kind of as the name implies, is thinking about the context in which that organization operates. And it really boils down to several things, issues within the organization itself, both internally and externally, and then probably equally important, interested parties. And those, again, could be internal or external interested parties. So that could be obviously your employees, that could be your supply chain, that could be the community you're in, that could be an industry body that you're part of. That also has a segue into legal and regulatory requirements. So those are some of the things that kind of make up the context. And thinking about the context, the idea is that then helps you define an appropriate scope. One of the unique things about ISO standards is that you can define the scope of what's being included. So it doesn't necessarily need to be the entirety of the organization. I would say most organizations do choose to do that because frankly, it just makes the most sense, number one, and it's also probably the easiest in terms of not having to kind of gerrymander what's in or what's out. I think what organizations find is even if they go into it thinking they want to just have a partial scope, by the time they draw boundaries around what's in and what's out and understand that there's supporting processes that are going to be in regardless, I think a lot of organizations find that it's just easier to say the whole thing's in scope versus trying to carve out a particular scope. But regardless to say, as I said, ISO does allow scoping. So the section 4 kind of leads up to that in terms of thinking about the context. And with regards to context, it encompasses a couple of things. So one of the questions that came in, shown here in red, was, isn't the context in BCMS a lot about what's identified in the BIA or the business impact analysis? And yes, that is true, but it's not just that. So context will also include, anything from internal things about the organization. So it could be different locations that the organization has or staffing levels the organization has. We talked about remote auditing and information communications technology, so the amount of technology an organization has could be part of its context. Where that organization is in terms of critical business within the entire statewide infrastructure, if you will, is part of that. So context definitely ties into the BIA, but it also, in addition to those threats and risks that would be pulled out through the BIA, also is about the organization itself. And again, those interested parties are key to it, along with legal and regulatory requirements. So that is kind of the thought there to set the stage of understanding what goes into the BCMS. With regards to changes in Section 4 in 2019, it kind of goes back to some more of the editorial changes. So some duplications have been reduced. I think particularly in Section 4.1, the context there was a lot of specifics about what needed to be documented, which was then reiterated in the various sections. So that chunk was taken out. We mentioned the risk appetite term was taken out, but that term, or the definition, really replaced it. So technically no new requirements. There was a small communication requirement to talk about changes to legal requirements. That technically has been removed, but what remains is that with regards to legal and regulatory requirements, that they be kept up to date. So it kind of is inferred that that would be communicated regardless. And then perhaps most significantly, again, that thought of locations as one way to identify or scope a BCMS was brought into the thought, again, recognizing that a lot of organizations are global these days or have multi-locations. And frankly, that usually serves as a benefit in a BCMS. So bringing that into the discussion. With regards to Section 5, which is the requirements for leadership or top management, if you will, I think the overall thought there is, again, nothing significantly changed. And if anything, the changes might have been allowing a little more flexibility or a little more looseness to top management. So for those of you on the call that are going to be reporting back to top management, that's probably good news for them. Not that they can completely walk away from this. There certainly are still many requirements of what leadership needs to ensure or be part of, but it gets a little more specific and a little looser. So again, a lot of the changes coming from that ISO high-level structure is what the HLS acronym stands for, so that ISO framework. So a lot of it aligned to that. The 2012 version did have, again, a little more specificity in terms of what top management was being called out for, or some of the roles and responsibilities that were within there. That's been loosened up or lightened up a bit. But I think what it boils down to is the two things you see there as A and B, parts of number 3. Previously in 2012, there was the thought of appointing one or more persons that was kind of termed as the management representative. If you really have been around ISOs for a while, that was kind of the management representative for this. That requirement, again, explicitly has been removed, but again, the thought is still there insofar as top management has authority to assign roles and assign people, but it just doesn't put it on any one individual's shoulders, certainly. And we'll see lots of talk about teams as we go along. So the intents are similar. The other change that we'll see about specificity is the dropping of requirements for top management to be actively engaged in exercising and testing. And that'll be interesting. But I think, again, it's recognizing the fact that the role of top management might not be to run an exercise or test. They may or may not even have a role in an exercise or test. I think it's likely that they might, but not in all cases. So as far as setting that hard line, that requirement is gone. Again, though, I think the intent is still good and remains that top management should certainly be aware of this and encourage it and participate when and where appropriate. Okay, moving on to section 6. One of the significant changes we will see here is that there was a new section 6.3 added. Now, for those of you that have already gotten the 2019 standard, it's an interesting dichotomy because ISO in its forward itself says that there's no new requirements. And I think you could argue that on either side. Certainly 6.3 planning changes to the BCMS is a new clause. Technically, it does have kind of vestiges of a previous requirement, and we'll talk about that. But I think this is worth highlighting as something that organizations are going to need to look at as they transition, because if nothing else, it takes a little more center stage. With regards to 6.1 and 6.2, though, the changes there are again more cleanup or more interpretation, trying to refocus people on the thought, particularly with 6.1, that when ISO in 6.1 is talking about risks or risks and opportunities, it's really pointing towards risks and opportunities within the management system or within the ISO program, of that being able to meet the intended outcomes. This again is one of those sections that all ISO standards have. So it did get a little confusing in 22301, where obviously business continuity has the whole risk assessment requirement and process. 6.1 in ISO, risks and opportunities, is really completely separate and distinct from the risk assessment of a business continuity program. So they're trying to emphasize that a little bit more. And then 6.2 objectives, just getting a little bit more specific there about what some of the objectives, business continuity objectives, should be. There was a question that came in again early about, it now talks about having business continuity objectives established at relevant functions and levels. So what's meant by the relevant functions and levels? Again, that's one of those ISO terms. So the terms needed to be retained because it was part of that base ISO structure. But in essence, what it can be interpreted to mean is really across the organization. So at various departments or across various processes, various roles. So for examples, you might have certain objectives, higher level objectives at the management level, as opposed to the business continuity team might have different, more tactical objectives. And then there might even be objectives kind of down at the general staff level. Think, for example, at the staff level, most people need to be aware of certain things or aware of their role if and when a business continuity plan is invoked. So the objective there could be gauging their awareness, which could be by a simple training or some other kind of awareness gathering exercise, as opposed to folks more intimately involved in the business continuity activities probably need to be a little more hands-on, have higher levels of competency. So there might be different objectives there that would be more tangible to the effectiveness or productivity of business continuity activities. All right, and then with regards to that section 6.3 that was mentioned, again, technically you can find a vestige of this coming out of 8.1 in the previous version of the standard, but it's really been expanded, really again with the thought that when things change, we all know that that's when things can start to lose some rigor or lose some control. So the emphasis here was to strengthen up that when you make changes to your business continuity management system, you simply need to consider these things. You need to consider the purpose of the change and the potential consequences, which is, again, kind of a risk-based thinking approach. So if you're going to change a given process, what's the knock-on effect? What's the potential consequence? And that kind of goes down to item B. You want to make sure that you maintain the integrity of the business continuity management system. So you don't want to change something and then retrospectively realize that you kind of took away one of the pillars. So you want to make sure that you maintain the integrity of the BCMS, make sure that there are resources available to support those changes. And again, that could be both forward and backwards in terms of what was added as far as a change, but also what consequences that brought about. And then lastly, that allocation or reallocation, as the case may need, with terms of responsibilities or authorities, which kind of dials back to resources there. So that's really the main emphasis there, just expanding upon what was previously a very minor mention about changes. I think it's a pretty self-explanatory clause, pretty self-explanatory thought. However, organizations that previously were certified or aligned to 2012 may have a little bit of work here in terms of thinking about what they're going to do there as far as implementing a process, if you will, and or having things to show or demonstrate the auditor as they come in. One of the examples that you might very well use to provide objective evidence of your planning of changes to the BCMS would of course be the transition itself. As you're going through and looking at your system and understanding that there need to be some changes to have you meet the new 2019 requirements, that of course gives you a perfect opportunity to demonstrate your planning of changes. So as you're going through your overall transition, be mindful of that. You've got the perfect opportunity to provide some objective evidence of how you've met 6.3 through your whole transition. As far as the overall summation of clause 6 then, again, I think the key thing is separating the risks and opportunities to the BCMS versus the risk assessment in clause 8, which if you've gone through this for a while, you probably already have gotten, but it will help folks coming into it, I think more so. And then I would say most significantly is that breakout of 6.3 in terms of changes to the BCMS. All right, and then moving on to clause 7, and then I'll hand it over to Jim after I go through a couple of changes here. Not too many changes in the whole of clause 7, so we're going to go very quickly through just a couple of the highlights. As the note up on the top indicates, really no new requirements throughout clause 7, just a lot of duplicate requirement cleaned up. On the competence side, the requirement now states that organization shall determine the necessary competence of people working under its control. And there was a question again that came in that we wanted to address that seemed to reference that competence was looking beyond continuity roles and to the larger organization. And I certainly would concur with that. Really, there needs to be thought across the organization about what competencies are needed. So it almost starts with a needs assessment of who needs what competencies. And oftentimes we'll see that portrayed in kind of a competency matrix, where again, not necessarily by an individual, but perhaps by a role or even a department or a team. Kind of going back to what we talked about before, people on the business continuity team with certain roles to roll out the business continuity plans or the emergency response activities or the communications. Those folks have different competencies than the rank and file that just need to know what to do or where to go when they're told. So think of that almost as a big difference between competence and awareness. It kind of becomes a continuum of determining who needs what competence, and then of course it's a matter of just making sure that they have that competence and how you get that. But I would agree that this goes across the organization from top management all the way down to the rank and file. Jumping ahead to clause 7.4 on communication. The changes here, again, were not necessarily new, but a little bit of cleanup in terms of some specifics on communication. Again, this is relevant to the BCMS. So again, we're not in clause 8, so we're still talking about the BCMS. So Relative to your ISO 22301 program, again, maybe you want to phrase it as what are you going to communicate, when, with whom, how, and who will do that communicating. So being pretty specific there about the communication process. That's expanded upon a little bit from what the previous 7.4 was, but the same kind of thought remains. Again, perhaps with a little more clarification, because in the new 7.4, a lot of stuff was removed because it was actually talking more about communication within the business continuity activities, which we'll still see, and we'll still see a lot of that in section 843, but that has been separated to the communication roles and responsibilities during, if you will, a continuity activity, as opposed to in 7.4 here talking simply about communicating about your ISO 22301 program or your BCMS, if you will. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn over the microphone to Jim and let him run through the second half of the standard.
Excellent. Thank you, Tim. Great job. When I bring up my screen, I have just a touch of latency. I just wanted to touch one thing. Tim had made a comment earlier. We were talking about doing remote or virtual audits. I've been exposed, as has Tim, and I'm sure many of the people on the call. Organizations may, as part of their business continuity strategy, have diversity where they do similar functions across geographically dispersed areas, maybe different time zones or in different corners of the country or in different regions around the world for redundancy or to follow the sun if they need to. So in that place, the remote and virtual audits I've been involved with several times, where we might have people on that are in the same reporting structure or in the same team capabilities, whether it's business continuity or more of an ICT/DR. So getting their perspective is the way more and more business operate versus trying to shove everybody in a conference room at one location as in the past. What is also good as an auditor and as a business continuity professional, you want to see the plans in action in time. So in the most recent COVID-19 pandemic, etc., I've done several audits, and it's an opportunity to see how their program works, which gets into Clause 8 as kind of a nice segue. Most of the operational content specific to business continuity is in Clause 8. So in here we talk about, near and dear to our heart, BIAs and risk assessments and driving strategy and solutions, planning and documentation. So I'm going to talk about some of the significant changes in the first, in Clause 8 and a couple of the sub-clauses. And again, as Tim had alluded to and Linda talked about a little bit, there was a lot of cleanup in her and a lot of good work that went in. So on the BIA, it called out tying together everything that you do following on to your business impact and to your risk assessments. In the older version, I'll just say there were several requirements that appeared in there more than one place. So in the latest version, trying to make that clear and point to it, and instead of, I saw many people over the last 7 years that were going through the certification process where they would get confused. I said, didn't we just talk about that in a previous clause? So it was viewed as a little bit of redundancy. So there was a lot of education that needed to go on in discussion with clients, depending how they built their management system. And again, as Tim would probably agree, there's a little art and science here, understanding the ISO requirement and then being able to interpret that to how an organization builds their program and how it is implemented, and being able to understand maybe not the exact use of words, but similar intent. So in the BIA, the process and the output have become a bit more prescriptive in that impact types and criteria need to be defined going back to the organization's context, which ties back a little bit to some of the earlier clauses Tim talked about. And identifying specific activity that allow you to do your work, whether it's goods, services, or process. Using some of the impact types and criteria for assessing was built and strengthened and given hopefully a little bit more clarity. And in addition, if you're going to have your RTOs, your recovery time objectives, or your maximum tolerable period of disruption, they need to be designated for each activity. So when we talk a little bit, there was a question that came in earlier asking for a little clarity about the impact types that can be used in the BIA. So the following is an answer to some of that question. So some sample impacts are whether they're financial, and most organizations have done a reasonable job, I've seen, of identifying money losses or fines or penalties or delayed ability to collect funds, reputation impacts, inability to hit business objectives, and then what are the impacts if you're not complying or aligned with. Those are just some general examples. And then sample loss of scenarios and their impacts. Just think a little bit over the last several weeks of what we've been dealing with globally in pandemic and COVID-19. So loss of employees or loss of access. And many organizations, to varying degrees of success, the employees may still be there and alive, but maybe they've been furloughed. Maybe they've been released or laid off, or they're waiting to return, or maybe you're having difficulty accessing those employees. So we're getting a little different perspective here on the facilities or loss of access. A lot of people, social distancing, can't go to their traditional workspace. Okay. Good. And then loss of technology or loss of access. Last week I was auditing a firm, and a few weeks before that another, where they're an international firm, where they really had to stand up. They had VPN for selected people and working from home for a percentage of their management, or key leadership, key personnel, or maybe their ICT technicians. As this rolled out globally, they had to expand those VPN sessions. So the consequence of that is your network people and your IT people got very busy trying to fit out and support the business, but they didn't have any actual activations in technology, no declarations, or none of the traditional loss of data center. They just had to, because people were asked to work remote and social distance, they had to jump. So it was loss of access from your desktop or working at home. So that's a different slant. And hopefully as we move forward, we can include that in our professional stuff. And I also look at that. Last week I was saying, what are your COVID actions? Because that's the perfect time to see a BCMS in action, whether it's a business continuity plan, an activation, or crisis. Same with suppliers and lack of being able to get materials and goods, whether they're PPD or whether they're masks and specific events. Risk treatment. Hold on one second.
So we have a question from the audience. When you were talking about the BAA being more prescriptive. The question is the ISO audit also expecting that organization would have looked at technical specs for BAA and qualification of third parties?
As an auditor, yes. I would probably want to explore that and discuss it. Technical specification, what is the criterion and what was the reason for deciding to do this or not? In addition, did you get the right people that were technically competent or understood the business drive? So I would explore that a little bit. And that kind of gets back to what Tim was talking about, is changes to the system, whether they occur at the BIA level or the risk assessment or a process or a management change. That's an excellent question. And again, as Tim had alluded to, some of these requirements are generic, but then being able to bring expertise to understand what the drivers were. Thanks. One other item is risk treatment is now moved into the next section. And I'll talk about that in a moment. Okay. The term in 8.3, one change here was strategies and the term solutions. There was a lot of discussion in the ISO of people doing the draft on strategy and solutions from different regions and languages. So really the compromise was, if you have a strategy, there should be a solution. Okay. For every strategy, you should have at least one solution or way to treat it, and whether it's a specific solution for each one of those strategies. So I think you'll see most auditors moving forward saying, what are your different strategies? You have 4, 5, 6 different strategies. You would expect at least one solution for each one of those strategies to be able to fulfill the spirit of the standard. So looking down on strategies, specific solution to meet each strategies, maybe using the current COVID-19 situations, we're able to use technology, as Tim had talked about, whether that's Teams or whether it's different platforms or Skype or GoToMeeting or WebEx. And you can use that technology to transfer work to another location, or in this, as many organizations, to many locations. In 8.3, we also have impacts to the changes. Strategies and solutions selected need to be directly connected or be able to map that as an outcome from the BIA and risk assessment. That was strengthened and added. And the strategy process must be clearly defined. How did you get there? There should be an overall strategy of the organization for achieving those business continuity. And you may select to implement a variety of strategies or more than one. And how did you determine those strategies? Multiple solutions are also new and as a change should be implemented to ensure that the various strategies are effective when needed. So again, there also needs, as the third point, to be a clear tie between a business continuity strategies and taking it back to that amount of risk and type of risk the organization may or may not take. Just risk appetite, I ran into that many things, and I'll comment on that. It really had its origins in the old Basel and banking and finance, and then it was picked up by 31,000 by risk assessment. But it created more problems than it solved, and the scope of how you were managing risk and what you decided to treat. So the amount of type, the definition, I think, has been a huge important upgrade. All right, double click there, got ahead of myself. In clause 8.4, they talk about continuity plans and procedures. Procedures are, again, an agreed upon term in ISO, and they're pretty much understood, and it was a trade-off on a global basis across regions and languages. But procedures should be specific. Do you need to take an immediate steps? And is it taken during a disruption or an event? But they also need to be flexible, so it can change and adjust by situations, either internally or external conditions. And make sure these procedures focus on the impacts of any incident that could potentially lead to a disruption. And finally, B is they need to be the procedures need to be effective, and they need to achieve their intent, which is minimize the impact. And E is new. Assign roles and responsibility for all of the tasks. That was not as crisp in the old standards. I do see many organizations will assign in their business continuity programs roles and responsibilities, and that ties to what Tim had alluded to, and we'll see this more. What was missing in the old standard. It was inferred, but it wasn't clearly called out, was the use of teams. Without teams, you're not moving forward to do much in business continuity plans. 8.4 subclause 2 looks at a response structure, and again, bringing in the use of teams, one or more teams, with those roles and responsibilities, and making sure the people in those positions are qualified or competent and willing to do it. What I'm seeing more and more of is a competency matrix. One technique auditors use is as they're introducing with a new business unit in the interview and documentation review process, who are you? What is your experience? By those opening questions, how long have you worked here? What is your job? Have you been engaged with business continuity DR, and for how long? And have you done it somewhere else? And is it a specific certification, or is it just following the training that may be provided at university, or is it experience? Second portion is the relationship between the teams must be clearly identified. So you have the proper communications going both ways, things being escalated and things being disseminated across. So that's clearly stated and understood in the BCMS. And personnel and alternates need to be identified. And some requirements are listed as each team, where others might be collectively. And again, there was a lot of work done in the different clauses to clean up some of this, to operationalize the business continuity specific stuff versus the management system, where items, this is some of the redundancy, where things were talked about in earlier clauses and driven here. And as Tim had alluded to, we had communications earlier. 8.4.3 tried to attempt it. I think has done a reasonable job of cleaning up the communication requirements that were several other places. And the requirements were redefined and put wherever possible in a centralized location, combining them and not having them spread across multiple clauses. And the idea of those new requirements is to improve the flow and readability. So I would say there's not a lot of new requirements on warning and communications. It's just a little better organized. 8.4.4 talks about the plans themselves, BCPs, and it makes sure that they document and maintain the plans and procedures. And the idea of these plans shall provide guidance and information to assist the teams. And again, driving that team focus, which was not as clear in the previous standard, and to help them for when they would be needed to respond to a disruption or a disruptive event, and then help the organization with its response and recovery. And again, some of the changes, a high level, each plan should be usable and available at the time and place where it's required. So that is a little bit more specificity than saying you're going to make updates, annually or when significant changes occur, whatever you might have done in the past. The overall driver is make sure if you need it, it's ready and effective. The most significant impact to 8.4.4 is it's editorial, it's cleaner. And those communication requirements that were in the old plan are centralized, as we just spoke about. There is one new requirement, and most of you should be aware of it, and it brings in environmental impacts. And that's been a consistent theme across ISO. So the new requirement, any consequence or impacts, if you have an outage or a problem, did you contaminate? Did you impact the environment? Was it a spill? Was it a leak? Did you use additional materials, carbon footprinting? Maybe it was energy and greening. So make sure you take advantage of that environmental side, and that can tie to some of the other ISO standards or your people doing environmental health and safety. Each plan needs to be reusable and available as a best practice. It was not a requirement in the previous standard. 8.5 talks about your exercise program, your validation, your tests, your drills, and it talks about, and then ties to make sure that you need to act on the results of those exercises and testing, and then to implement those changes and improvement that Tim talked about a little bit, and documenting those changes and impacts and roll-on factors to those changes and improvements. Okay, we have one question.
So there's actually kind of two questions for here. It says, what's the expectation from the auditors on testing and the normal BIA cycles? Kind of tied to that, now that we have a live pandemic incident, are organizations still expected to do the normal testing?
I think that's a case-by-case basis, and the auditor needs to be sensitive to that. A specific example, last week I was working with the firm for their surveillance and ongoing reassessment, and they determined that if the business units had successfully invoked their pandemic or crisis response, that would count as an exercise and a drill, and they were not looking for them to maybe do a tabletop or a simulation for many of the areas. However, the IT, ICT, and disaster recovery plans, they specifically wanted to make sure they could continue to hit those established exercise dates, especially if they included customers. And it was a wonderful opportunity to see if the users of those systems and interested parties still had the capabilities that were expected if they were in a remote worker or coming in from a VPN type session. So that's one example where a company made a decision and they documented it. That yes, we're not going to make it redundant for some areas that have successfully done it, but our technology is important, and the change we made for pandemic, what a wonderful opportunity to check that out. Hopefully that answers that question. Did you have another one there, said Linda? Okay. That being said, I'll keep moving. I'll just comment on this exercising and testing. Really, the idea is it validates the effectiveness of what you put together for strategies and solutions. What I do see, and it's something where I can maybe make it an opportunity for improvement or a comment or push a little bit back for the organization to consider, is what do they use for scenario? Have they done the same scenario for the last 2 or 3 years where it's the data center is gone or they have a fire? Maybe push them to use different situations or different scenarios and vary those scenarios. And there's some larger companies, they may roll out test and exercise where everybody works on the same scenario for that particular year. So I've got to have a little bit of understanding there is what's the pros and cons, what's the benefit? Is it just overwhelming task to have everybody doing something different? So that's where you can use the third party, say, why are you doing it this way? What is the benefit? Is there a way to do it better? And have you looked at other scenarios and situations? But the main thing is to keep it effective and available. So the standard is tightened up in that it's making sure that the organization will act on the results. What did you learn? Lessons learned and activities. And again, as an auditor, that's something you're looking for. Why are you doing this? And how are you using this additional information? Okay. Now I'm going to talk about a little bit. There were some items that was moved from Clause 9 to 8.6. And the read was to strengthen and improve the evaluation of your business continuity inputs and outputs and plans and capability. So it is done regularly and not periodically. So after an incident. So 9.2 was not blue, or the text wasn't restricted by ISO in Clause 8. So deciding why don't we take those impacts and bring them right into Clause 8. And along with that, conduct evaluations of partners and supplier was moved around a little bit to make it more effective. So there's not a lot of new requirements, but the intention was really to bring some laser focus on the evaluation of all processes and all elements of Clause 8. Clause 9, as Tim had referred to, is generally an overview of the management system itself. And that's why some of those more specific items were moved to Clause 8. So 9, 10, and Clause 9.1, 9.2, 9.3 is performance evaluation. Is someone watching in? Are you getting monitoring? Are you getting good matrix and analysis of how the management system is doing? And then 9.2, internal audit. Are your people? I am seeing more and more people. And just sharing internal auditor. After I've sat down and done the first one and we're under surveillance, I will discuss, kind of open-ended, it'd be wonderful if that organization had someone internally that had the same competence as an outside third-party independent auditor. The reason for that is that gives a consistency. You've got somebody who lives in the organizations and they're speaking the same language as someone like myself or Tim coming in. In addition, it keeps that third-party auditor on track and accountable. And so there's great value. And I've seen more and more people, whether it's in the business continuity group or internal audit or compliance, that are adding capabilities of a lead auditor or an implementer to their skill set. Management review. Okay. Impacts on the changing the Clause 8. Okay. There was some blue content and there was some editorial changes. One item I will talk about that is emphasized in the new standard. The old standard kind of talk about briefing executive management. And here is our status of our plan, here's our update, here's what we're doing. The new standard also says, what are the output from those management review sessions? So you get an input to management review or top management and an output. You gave them a report, you gave them a status, what are you doing? What did they do with it? And what was the directive that management group asked, and are they actively engaged in giving you a response versus just accepting an update on the program? So the management review inputs and outputs really allows for the auditor and the implementer to meet the requirements and to make sure that that's not getting lazy and a little bit sluggish. Tied to clause 8.6, included in the management reviews. Clause 10 really is how do you improve the system, and that's normally terms used are OFIs, opportunity for improvements, or AFIs, area for improvements. And there's two elements. If you have a nonconformity, as Tim talked about, and then the corrective action process within the ISO world. But then there's a driven on always continuous improvement. So in audits, most third-party auditors are looking to say, maybe they're not recommending it, as Tim said, we can't consult, we can't advise, but we can ask open-ended questions and maybe discuss with people, how can you do it better? Why are you doing this way? Are there better ways to do it? So a quick summary of the changes. Things that were duplicate were consolidated. Some things were placed in a few other areas for clarity within the standard. The formatting was cleaned up to make sure bullets and numbering. That helps the auditor. Instead of having to copy and paste an entire clause, you can go right to a specific requirement. Changed establish and implement and maintain, again, as Tim talked about, the implement and maintain wherever was written. And then clarification that certain clauses talked about the management system, and clause 8 is where really a lot of the meat and potatoes and substance as you operationalize your business continuity changes. Additionally, look at that clause 8.3, strategies and solutions, and the addition of clause 8.6. Take a look at, in transition, the focus on teams, and again, beginning in the response structure and then rolling throughout the clause and the management system.
Right. We have got quite a few questions, and there's two questions that have come up earlier that I'm going to start with. One of the first question was what is the cost to do a self-assessment against ISO? And then we just named, the cost of I-Core self-assessment is actually a tool that you can purchase. We had a 2012 version, and that 2012 version, if you purchased it there, it's half the price. It's $495. Otherwise, the tool is $995. The second question is, what does it cost to have an I-Core certified lead auditor conduct an assessment for your program to the ISO 22301 standard? Our answer from I-Core was that we can't consult and we can't conduct audits, but we can provide you with the listing of those who are credentialed by I-Core, and you can use that maybe to put together your RFP. Tim and Jim, there are a couple other questions that I wanted to share, and either one of you can feel free to answer this. This is a long question, so I'm going to ask the whole question.
Okay.
The first one is, what is the driver for certification? Are they seeing yet as a requirement for strategic suppliers, or to still be nice to have? What industries are requesting or requiring more that are requiring this? Which industries are pursuing? Is self-assessment a good first step? And I think we answered a couple of those other ones, but looking at that driver for certification. And what is also the cost for certifying to ISO? I think a general ballpark was being asked for.
All right, I'll take a stab at that, and then Jim can add in as well if he's got anything else. As far as drivers, I think it's different industry by industry. There are some industries that are more tuned into business continuity, or at least were. I think everyone's kind of tuned into it now. So historically, let's say pre-pandemic, it was a lot of service organizations and kind of those in the financial or healthcare space. And by financial, I mean, inclusive of finance and insurance and stuff like that. And then I guess the next biggest group would have been manufacturers. But there's also a large segregation, if you will, by regions. The US, unfortunately, is one of the slower to adopt ISO standards historically. So we see large numbers coming out of the UK in particular. They're always kind of leaders with ISO, but also then significant numbers coming out of some of the APAC countries like Japan and Korea. If you were to look at it by, and there's a thing called the ISO survey. So if you look at it by sites, number of sites certified, the US is actually in the top three, number three. And I think that just goes to show that a lot of organizations in the US, not as many organizations necessarily doing it, but those organizations that are doing it are multi-sited or kind of, in some cases, multinational organizations. As far as the, again, back to the drivers, I have seen cases where it is driven through a supply chain, although usually it's more inquiry based. You will get a questionnaire about your business continuity program, and one of the questions might be, are you compliant with or are you certified to ISO 22301? I've seen cases where if you can answer affirmatively to that, you don't need to answer the remaining questions or pages of questions, that they will take that independent certification as an attestation. So that certainly would be a significant benefit if you're getting a lot of those questionnaires and spending time doing that or entertaining additional follow-on or even maybe customer audits themselves. And as far as the cost goes, highly variable, again, from organization to organization. It's really based as a function of the size of the organization to some degree and the way that the business continuity system is set up. So how many different procedures or plans there are to review, how many departments are involved that need to have their piece of the pie reviewed. So it's highly variable based on that. But broad ballpark, I guess, would be anywhere from a few $1,000s to probably maxing out, to be honest, at in maybe the $25,000 range. Most organizations are going to be in the few $1,000s range to get initially certified. I guess the thing to remember, though, is that does need to be maintained. The surveillance audits are lower cost, lower duration as well, though. That's my thoughts.
One other question, it says, does the audit process involve interviews, and can a list of what is required for documentation be provided in advance? So a virtual audit, or really any audit, can be more.
Yeah, and definitely with virtual audits, that's one of the things that we're finding across all types of virtual audits is having a good planning process with the auditor and the organization to, number one, just set up the logistics of the various meetings or web sessions you might have is key. But then to the questioner's point of having documents ready, because if you know you're going to audit a given process, the auditor can discuss with you the types of documents or records or artifacts that they're going to want to see. You as the organization can get some ready, or at least get access to that file set. A good auditor, frankly, will want to take their own sample, that they will recognize when you're stacking the deck, so to speak, in terms of taking the sample and just presenting it to them. So be ready to have a variety of samples ready if you're doing a remote audit. But again, good pre-planning will set a stage for a good, successful virtual audit in that respect.
But it does include interviews as well, correct?
Yep. So it doesn't. Yeah, right. So yeah, unlike financial audits where a lot of it is behind closed doors, the auditor pouring through piles of books or binders, or I guess computer screens now, as the case would be. In the ISO world, we're typically sitting with at least one person at all times. I mean, there are some times where the auditor is going to want to take a look at some lengthy documents, and there's no need to have someone watching over his or her shoulder, having him or her read. But for the most part, we're working with either the business continuity lead or business continuity manager, because yeah, most of it is a discussion. It's not, even though we're looking at documents and artifacts, the ISO auditor really wants to understand how you, the organization, interpreted the given requirements and how you think you're meeting the requirements. It's not meant to be looking for how you didn't do something or looking for the one gap necessarily. The best audits, again, are kind of a two-way conversation where the auditor says, okay, let's talk about this. Here's the requirement. Tell me how you met that. And then they open the floor to you or your team to discuss that, and the dialogue takes off from there. So definitely an interactive process with potentially multiple interviewees.
Hey, Tim, it's Jim. I have just a tip for people considering this. What I normally have, and there's two pieces to this. If you're trying to run an audit, I have a minimum of at least 2 machines that I'm working on. So one, I can pay attention to the customer, and the third, I can make notes or refer to the standard. If you can get multiple screens and functionality, that's a key. Second is there's kind of been a habit where let's set up a 1-hour session and a 45-minute session. Recently, it has a lot of value to set up an all-day session so you're not losing time and efficiency for logging in and having problems, and then just have those interview target people come and participate at their particular time. In addition, especially now with COVID and remote auditing and virtual auditing, understanding is, hey, here's the platform, here's the ICT technology that the client decided to use. Because in most cases, I'm using their system, whether it's Teams or something. It's a pretty valid observation, is if their system has problems, it's hiccuping, it's not available, has sound qualities, then I would say, is this the same system that you would use in a declaration and activation in a situation? If the answer is yes, it's like maybe you want to look for a different technology. Just something to consider. Let me kick this one back to Linda.
We had another question about saying, is self-assessment a good first step? And I'll just say that a lot of organizations use a self-assessment, not just for program improvement, but also to measure their readiness for a third-party audit. It's a really good tool to determine your readiness. Another question from the audience was, could you give us some advice on running an integrated conformity assessment, including 22301 and ISO 9001, for example? Tim, did you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah. There are a lot of benefits to doing that, because one of the key things, as we didn't really harp on too much, but pretty much all ISO management system standards now follow that same structure. So that structure that we went through, essentially the clauses 4 through 10, where the auditable requirements are, whether it's 22301 or 9001 or 27001, they're all going to have that same structure. And even more than that, they're all going to have some of the base words in the requirements. That, again, is something we kind of alluded to. Some of the changes in this standard were because those base words or phrases were changed in their underlying Annex SL structure. And then lastly, any definitions that are common are going to be common too. So things like non-conformance and corrective action and management review, that's all going to be common. So there's a lot of synergy there. So if you think about that, where we said that section 8 of the standard is really where the bulk of the flavor comes out, the inverse of that is that the other sections, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, and 10, are going to be where a lot of the overlap or a lot of the commonality is. So if you've got, let's say, a 9001 system, because that's where most people are at, it's a relatively light lift to add 22301 on top of that. Now, one of the biggest challenges I see, because we have had organizations do that, is you usually need to get multiple or different people or subject matter experts at the same table, though, because if you want to leverage what was done for the 9001 program, you kind of need to understand who built that and why they built it and how it works to some degree. But obviously the business continuity folks are going to have the business continuity experts, so you need to be at the table as well to understand how to layer that on top of what was already built. So I guess a top tip for success there is make sure you've got both sides of the multiple disciplines at the table if you're going to expand on that. But as far as the viability of it, very viable. We have organizations that do many integrated standards, and there are also advantages from the audit side. There are many auditors that carry multiple disciplines. So not only do you gain the internal benefits, but potentially with your external audit, you could have one auditor or at least one audit being running perhaps with a team. And again, have those common areas be hit only once, covering both disciplines, as opposed to having going through it twice, each for individual standards. So yeah, good question, good thought.
Thank you, Tim. I have one last question. This one's for Jim. When we're looking at clause 8.441D3, notice we now have a letter, a number in front of every requirement. What does the auditor look for when looking for impact to the environment?
The new requirement on environment, well, first I would look at the context of the organization. What does the organization do? Which industry sector are they in? Do they have big environmental impacts? You know, if something goes loose, are they going to contaminate? Is a dam going to break? Are they going to lose services? But it's also on the beneficial side is I would want to talk to the environmental health and safety people or the facilities people. But I'd also look at how do you dispose of equipment? You know, maybe it's ICT equipment, or batteries or something that has a certain hazard. And finally, there's another side. Think of our current COVID situation, environmental impact. Is the organization having less commuting? Is air traffic down? Is travel down? Are automobiles down? That could potentially be something where you're tracking your environmental impact. Or the flip side of that is, are you using more energy and network? So it really is a case-by-case basis, and it would be a discussion I would open and try and talk with the appropriate party in that organization that owns that environmental responsibility.
So we know we are well over our usual hour. We thank you all who stuck with us the entire time. If there's any other questions, we will take a look at those and send them to you. Just wanted to let you know that all of the I-Corps courses are live online. We've actually done what we call blended learning for years. So we have just enacted that for everything. So we are actually adding to our schedule versus subtracting from our schedule. So everything from transitioning from the one standard to planning to be an auditor. We have a full scale of business continuity courses. In addition, our next webinar is actually coming right up on June 10th. It's called Hackers, Hashtags, and Health Emergencies. Does your crisis communications plan reflect today's reality? And she'll be specifically looking at the COVID response and some of the communications that you should be doing both internally and externally, as well as the rest of our year of webinars. And we have answered most if not all of your questions. We invite you to contact the auditors individually as well, and their contact information is here. And we thank you for attending, and we hope you'll attend next month as well. Good day, everyone.